the democratization of music. I remember in an interview with a relatively young Kanye West before all the anti-Semitism, he was talking about how a digital drum set had provided a tool for him to create, as he called it, dope music. Whereas otherwise he would have not had any access to all these different sounds that he was able to put together with just this digital drum set. So from that perspective, I think that there's definitely a case for people that normally don't have access to any real tools to create music, as they are very expensive, or can be at least. And that is a very beautiful thing, I think. That's people, I think everyone has some sound, some melody in their mind, and perhaps these tools are the best way to produce them and bring them out. But from another perspective, one could say, and we see it now with ChatGPT, this is a really good, relatively good programmer, and as a programmer, as we discuss our role in the society of the future, the fact that one might no longer need to learn a musical instrument or need to learn programming. The pain of having to learn how to stroke a violin is something that is in itself perhaps part of the musical training. Don't you think? That perhaps that part of that romantic part of having to go through the grind of it is something that might be disappearing with this.
Kind of. I think that there's a lot of things to address here. First of all, democratization. This is a word that is used quite often by companies and tool developers providing these services, without thinking about what does it mean democratization. This is referring to democracy, which is kind of a form of government in which votes are held. A majority, the decision of the majority gets its way. Where's the voting in this the marketplace in which these tools are supposed to be democratizing things? I think what is meant instead of democratization is a reduction of the cost of access, maybe, to this technology that becomes available to more people. Although, to use these kinds of technologies requires, electricity, requires, a computer with a sufficient amount of power, connectivity to the internet, some literacy in terms of how to work with a computer, right? Like my parents, it took a couple lessons to teach them how to use a mouse. What is a mouse? And then a trackpad. Now, that was weird. So I think, so democratization and accessibility, increasing accessibility. When I also mentioned earlier about people are not willing to pay the true price of things, it's not just out of the wallet. It's also out of the labor that's required to appreciate something or to develop an understanding. And this is another aspect of neoliberalism that I find abhorrent to my profession as an educator, as a person that is teaching at a higher institution. In some sense, the institution is a business, the university, KTH, and it's seeking to, with great government subsidy, be self-sustaining, let's say, to bring in money from corporate collaborations, government grants, etc. A neoliberal perspective of education is that the job at the end of the production line is the justification for one's education. If you don't get a job in what you've been educated in and you're not making money, then that education was not worth it. And I find that perspective quite narrow, and it doesn't account for the real purpose of education, which is to help someone become a productive member of society that can think critically, be able to weigh evidence and form educated opinions, to participate in society in a way that is in the interest of the public good. It's not about the job at the end of the line. In music, it's kind of the same. You have to become an accomplished pianist. You have to put in the time to understand the interaction with the body and the piano, to understand the vocabulary, the mechanics. This time is not, in a sense, justified by playing in Carnegie Hall in 20 years' time, but through the procedure of interacting with the instrument, with interacting with the quote, language, the syntax of music, you develop an appreciation for, or an embodiment of being with the instrument physically. I started on this, as a personal story, I started on this path of AI music generation in 2015, applying some basic language modeling to textual representations of Irish traditional music transcriptions. At the time, I really didn't have a true understanding of what this data encompassed. I knew there was lots of data. I knew I had heard Irish traditional music performed before, and I could play some on an accordion, what have you. But it wasn't until a few years later that I started to think, all right, I need to build up an appreciation for this data. Where does this data come from? What are the dynamics at play in the collection of this data and providing it online, sharing it, playing it with others, etc. So I started to take accordion lessons with a teacher who comes from a particular region in Ireland. It was online during the pandemic. We started during the pandemic. And this was really the first time in my life that I was devoting a significant amount of my time to playing my instrument. Now, the accordion is, something it's very physical, right? It's like this lung that you play. You've got buttons. You're not able to look at the buttons to look where your hands are on either side. You've got bass buttons on the left-hand side. You've got to breathe. This particular kind of instrument has a different note, push-pull, so my fingers may not change position, but if I push or pull the air out or in of the instrument, the pitch changes, which is very strange at first. But after spending a couple thousand hours on this instrument, I started to really understand the physical connection with the instrument and what's required in order to produce particular sounds, ornaments that is acceptable within traditional Irish music in a particular region. Maybe it's unacceptable in another particular region of Ireland. But through this time, all this time that I spent playing and gaining an appreciation, it's not the end result that's the goal. It's that whole path that gives me an appreciation for listening to myself, approaching a new tune, listening to another performer play on that same instrument, listening to another performer play on a different instrument. I mean, it's an incredible amount of work that's necessary. So now we have AI systems like Performance RNN or Music Transformer, which can generate realistic sounding, human-like piano music, novel performed piano music. And again, with this neoliberal position, we don't need the human musician, we don't need the human composer, we don't even need the mastering engineer in the recording studio because these are all automated. We can get to where we think we want, with a minimum amount of cost, which is good for certain sectors.